The time period I'm going to be talking about today is 1760 to 1774. I'm going to discuss the British military rule, Treaty of Paris, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, James Murray, Guy Carleton, and the Quebec Act of 1774. Alright, so here remember, in North America, the British chose to focus in North America, and with their three-pronged attack, they were able to gain control of Quebec and Montreal, and eventually the French surrendered. So they had officially won the war in North America, but there's still war going on in Europe. So there's this time of flux where the Canadians, the French, and the British are not really sure what's going to happen because, as we've learned in the past, North America has been used as a prize for wars that happen in Europe. And there is a chance that France could win the war in Europe, and then North America, the colonies, would then return to France. So it was this sort of time where no one really knew what was going on. So they had to establish a temporary government, the British, because they had officially technically won in North America and they were in charge, but they didn't have a formal government. So they decided to put it under British military rule, which means there was the governors put in charge, and they were members of the military. The head of the military was in New York in the 13 colonies, and he was sort of making the decisions from that distance. But there weren't any great changes because the French far outnumbered the British, so you couldn't make drastic changes or they could revolt. And because they outnumbered you, there was a chance they could win. So they needed to keep the peace. But the French still had some worries. You know, they had lost the war in North America, and if Britain wins the war in Europe, they would become a British colony. So they were worried about deportation. They remembered what happened to the Acadians. They were worried about that they would lose their language, they would lose their religion, and they'd have to take on a new culture. Between 1760 and 1763, they were able to maintain these things. Civil laws and courts were maintained because the British really didn't have the means to make any great changes, and they didn't want to do anything too drastic for fear that the French would revolt. And in 1763, the war in Europe is over, and the British win. And they write the Treaty of Paris, 1763. And really, the things that are outlined in this treaty are things that had already been happening in Quebec for the last 3 years. The economy was restored. There were some issues about French currency and British currency, and that was worked out. Military courts continued to use French civil law. They'd been doing that for 3 years. There was no deportation. They said that the French would not be deported out of Quebec. The Roman Catholic Church could remain. It wouldn't have as much power as it had in the past, but people could still practice their faith, and churches could still run. The seigneurial system remained as well, which was important. They could maintain the language and some of their customs. Now, the British at this time had a few choices. Because they were so far outnumbered, 1/3 of the population of North America was French. And in Quebec, for every 100 people, 3 of them were British. So there was this huge imbalance in population, and there's this question of loyalty. If you're far outnumbered, are they really British? Are they really going to be loyal to you? Are they really going to fight? So they had some options. And even though deportation was supposed to not be allowed, as per the Treaty of Paris, they were still considering that. So they were thinking about deportation, status quo, leave things as they were, isolation, have a territory for the French, have a territory for the British, and have a territory for the Aboriginals. Because the Aboriginals had a long-standing alliance with the French, and the British were worried that that alliance was pretty strong, and they weren't sure if they could then move that alliance, or they questioned the Aboriginals' loyalty. And then there was assimilation. So assimilation was they hoped that the French would just be absorbed into the British culture, and they would willingly and freely give up their French culture and customs and become British. Because at the time, the British really thought that they were better, and that if someone learned about the British culture, that they would automatically want to be British. So the British chose assimilation. They thought it would be easy to just have the French become British. So they wrote the Proclamation of 1763. It's sometimes referred to as the Royal Proclamation. And it was designed to answer the question of what are we going to do with Quebec? It's so French, and they wanted it to be more British. So they wanted to introduce customs and language and religion. They wanted people to speak English. They wanted the Protestant religion to be introduced and practiced. They thought that this would increase the number of British people moving to Quebec from the 13 colonies and also from Britain. And in the proclamation, they assured the Aboriginals could maintain their land for hunting and for their fur trade. They were trying to gain a new alliance and to gain the trust of those Aboriginal groups who had originally been allied with the French. So at this time, the civil rule replaced military rule. And the British decide that a British governor is going to be in charge in Quebec. And they send over James Murray. He is the first governor. And he finds it really difficult to enforce Proclamation 1763. He starts to empathize with the Canadian, and he sees the value in them maintaining their religion and maintaining their customs and their language. So he doesn't do a great job of making Quebec more British. So eventually he's pulled from Quebec. And he's replaced with Guy Carleton in 1768. And Guy Carleton, instead of finding it difficult, he completely rejects it. And he realizes and says that assimilation is impossible, that there is no way that the French are just going to give up their culture and become British, especially with such an imbalance in population. When there's such a small group, how can you absorb this other culture and this other group that is so much bigger? So he actually introduces something that they didn't have a word for then. We call it biculturalism now, but he went to the British government and said, look, the only way for us to succeed in North America is if we allow the French to live their way, and the British can live their way. And we are under the British Empire, but we all live together. And he must have been pretty persuasive because the British government supported it. So in 1774, they established the Quebec Act. And this was the aim. The aim was to strengthen the British Empire by allowing French and British ways, so that these two cultures could live side by side under the British Empire. So the French could maintain their language, they could maintain their culture, they could maintain their religion, and the British could do the same. So there were some of the stipulations and rules in the Quebec Act were the Quebec had to be run by the British, there had to be a governor in charge that was British, but the Roman Catholics could then participate in the government. They weren't as a high position as they were in the Sovereign Council, but they did have a voice. And French civil law would continue in Quebec, so that day-to-day property and some minor disputes, that law would stay in place.